Hi, welcome to the webinar. We're just going to wait a minute or so while people join in, and then we'll get things going. Okay, let's begin. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on the economic impact of AI. I'm Professor Andrew Stephen. I'm the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing here at the school, and one of the academic directors of one of our AI executive programs, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And I'm joined by my colleague Matthias Holvig, who is the American Standard Professor of Operations Management here at the school, and another one of our AI experts on the faculty and directors of various AI programs, which we'll hear about later on as well. Thanks for joining, Matthias.
Oh, nice to be here.
It's always fun for us to get together and chat about AI from various perspectives. And that's going to be the main focus of today's webinar. Let me just kind of walk everybody through what our agenda is. And really the focus on thinking about this notion of there's a lot of disruption going on, but how do we bring all of this excitement, but perhaps confusion around AI as it currently is, a very fast-moving thing. But think about it really in terms of actually generating value for the business, value for customers, value for other stakeholders relevant to all of your different types of organizations. So as I said, you've got myself and Matthias, and hopefully many of you will also have some questions for us once we get into the Q&A later on. We're going to start with Matthias and I kind of asking each other some questions before we go into the open Q&A, but please do use the chat to put any questions in there as they come to mind, and then we'll go over that in the Q&A time later. And then there'll be a bit of time at the end where we'll tell you a bit about the exec programs that Matthias and I are running, and also hear from Alex, one of our colleagues on the exec ed team, who can tell you how you can find out more information if that's of interest. But what we actually thought we'd do first is just a little poll, just to kind of get us warmed up, I suppose. So why don't we open up that poll? And what we're curious to hear from you is, what's the biggest motivator for your organization to invest in AI at the moment? And we've got a few options there, but if it's something else, the last option, by all means select that, and we'd love you to pop what that something else is into the chat, so we can see all the different things that are motivating your organization's investments in AI at the moment. So go ahead and vote, and then let's take a look and react a little bit to what you've said. Okay, give you a few more seconds. All right. Let's close the poll and have a look at what everybody has said. Okay, so we've got the number one thing here. I'm curious what your reactions are, Matthias, because the first one is about operational efficiency, 42%. What do you think about that?
For one, I'm pleased, of course, being, an operations management person. But no, I think, number one and two in that sense are quite aligned. But I think I would also have chosen that for the simple reason that I do see so many processes that would benefit from an AI adoption, right? To take something very specific, a specific part of an existing process, and just make it better, faster, But of course, that's not so much the disruption, that's more the mundane improvement, right, within an existing process. But no, I'm very pleased, actually. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly reflects, I think, what what I see in lots of different companies these days where, I guess their ways of dipping the toes into AI investments is really thinking about, making existing processes more efficient, and going in that direction. Um, it's good to see also they're actually the third most popular choice around improving the customer experience. Obviously, I'm a marketing professor, so I like that one. But I think that's a growing one. They're sort of shifting from, okay, we've made things more efficient internally and started to improve processes, and I guess not just making them, let's say, faster and cheaper, but also better.
Yeah.
Um, but that at some point needs to spill over in terms of the actual experience that your customers have, and how you're creating value for them. So I think that's really good to see. Um, not a lot on say unlocking new revenue streams, but I think that will be maybe a more emergent motivator once you kind of go through the phase of efficiency gains, thinking about improving experiences and processes, starting to see some wins, the competitive advantage point there. Then that might open up more opportunities to be thinking about bigger innovation that AI can help support. So I think it's a good reflection actually here in the poll of certainly what I'm seeing with all the different companies that I'm working with and talking to these days. Okay, well, great.
Yeah, nice. Well, I mean, let's follow up straight on that, right? Because I mean, if let's assume we're going forward, right, for the next 2 or 3 years, we'll have, the first simple agents being developed in-house. Building agents becomes, as easy as creating a custom GPT is now.
Mhm.
So where would you see the sort of the greatest economic opportunities in that time frame? Let's say 3 years from now.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah, it's a really, I mean, this is a perfect segue from the poll. Well, look, to build on what I was just saying, in relation to sort of say the improving customer experience and thinking about new revenue streams, I think that's where we're going to see, if we look sort of 2, 3 years down the track, um, where the bigger opportunities are going to come from. And I think that's for a few reasons. One, I think it's just part of the evolution of how organizations are using AI. As I said, starting out with sort of, let's call it the simpler or the low-hanging fruit sort of efficiency and operations type things. But then once you've done that, the question is what's next? And if everybody has done that, then the sort of competitive advantage starts to diminish when it becomes just sort of a table stakes type thing. So if you're thinking ahead more strategically, I think it really is about thinking about how can we create new sources of value. And if I take a sort of a customer-centric approach to that, then it's really thinking about, okay, well, does this mean new products and services that have some AI element to them? Maybe augmenting a physical product, or a purely sort of very AI first type of digital service, for instance. They
Mhm.
could become new revenue streams, and you certainly see companies doing that type of thing at the moment. So there's opportunity there, but I think also, like, aligning with what, if we need to think 3 years down the line, let's think about sort of customers, of all shapes and sizes and forms, whether we're talking sort of in consumer markets, or business to business, or whether we're talking products or services, or even we're talking sort of citizens in terms of, say, government services in the public sector. What are they going to be expecting from the sort of AI-enabled offerings that come from companies? And where are they therefore going to perceive the value and be willing to pay for that? So, to me, it really feels like we need to be shifting in the direction of looking for those new revenue streams, looking for new sources of value to customers and therefore to the business, and starting to frankly lay the foundations for those types of things now, so that you can be ready, when the market is ready, the customers are ready. Let's say 2, 3 years from now.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, you saw probably the announcement by Klarna just today that they will go back on their pure AI-enabled customer service, and they will bring back people, right, as the
Mhm.
ultimate measure of redress, right? If you really need to speak to someone. So I think we are probably not there yet, or it's evolving, right? What customers do expect from our processes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly it's not clear that, it's an AI only Oh, so a bit
Hmm.
that's AI first. I like that notion. So if you were to sort of give practical advice to a leader who says, "Well, okay, I've implemented AI to improve processes. I've done a few narrow implementations, let's say in operations for maintenance or whatever else. Maybe, yeah, operations background, right? So I'll probably pick that. But let's say, customer recommender systems, and you like it, and you think, strategically, what can this do for my business? What's the practical way of going about it to work out how it can support your strategy?
Yeah, I mean it's I mean strategy is the key word there. And so, not to be critical of what companies have been doing so far, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of I use the term dipping your toes or sort of dabbling with AI has been, early stages work in different companies to kind of see, okay, where does this fit in? A lot of pilot tests, experiments, sort of, small scale projects. And I think, one of the things to be thinking about is how do you move from pilot to kind of large scale deployment of AI systems with all of the resources and investment required to do that. And so practically speaking, it's fundamentally a strategic question. Thinking, okay, well, what are our strategic goals in the business, irrespective of AI, and how can we bring AI in to support our ability to achieve and exceed those goals. So I think that's a maturation type thing. I mean, I think practically some really interesting things we've been seeing. Actually, we're working on a case study with Reckitt, who some of you may be familiar with. Yeah, big consumer goods company, global consumer goods company based here in the UK, with all sorts of consumer brands in different product categories. So brands like Dettol, you know, fascinating category, I guess, cleaning products. But brands like that, or Nurofen in terms of headache painkillers, Mucinex, another sort of over-the-counter pharmaceutical brand in many countries. Durex in terms of sexual well-being and sexual health products. So big classic consumer goods conglomerate. And one of our execs in residence, her name's Elaine Rodrigo. She's the chief insights and analytics officer for the group, but has been leading their AI initiatives in marketing and customer insights. And so we're working a case study with her and their CTO at the moment. And what's really interesting for them, which is really this whole point about going from pilot to large scale deployment and aligning with overall corporate strategy, and then in their case, the sort of the business strategies in each of their brands in the whatever 100 or so markets around the world that they're operating in. What they've done is really strategically mapped out all of the different processes, all of the different sort of jobs in some sense that are done, all the way through, sort of R&D and product development through to, marketing and media and advertising and all the other sort of commercial elements of distribution and so on. What they've done to try and get this strategic alignment is mapped out those processes and looked at where AI can be best inserted into those processes and what the use cases would be. So it sort of started with a strategic mapping exercise, so they could figure out, okay, well, what are our strategic goals as a company? And then therefore, what will the goals be for the AI strategy that align with those corporate strategic goals? And then where are the best places to deploy at large scale different applications or use cases for AI systems? So it's a very practical and sort of methodical way, but in some sense, it starts with taking stock of the current situation, looking for where those opportunities are, having clear criteria for selection. So one of the things that we've learned in working on this case study with them is, there's a million things they could do, but obviously there's limited resources. And so they learned a lot through piloting different things. I think they ran sort of 10 different use case pilots across the organization. But then they had to, yeah, and actually they found all those pilots were successful in one way or another, but they weren't all equally successful and equivalently successful on the same sort of criteria. So then they really had to, as a leadership team at the, with including the CEO, work through all right, so what are the priorities here? And how do we actually select which of these we're going to go deeper on to scale? And that was guided by the corporate strategy. It wasn't sort of guided by some other sort of set of criteria set or selection parameters. It was very much, okay, what are we trying to do as a company in the next 3 to 5 years? What are our shareholders expecting of us? What are our employees expecting of us? What are our customers expecting of us? And let's use that to guide the sort of the strategy of scaling AI. So, I like that as sort of a practical example because it kind of goes back to basics in terms of kind of any investment decision you're going to be making in a business. It should be aligned with the strategic direction of the company, not sort of something off to the side just because it's a shiny new toy.
Sure.
So I think that's the way you start to get this alignment between the long-term business goals and what's going on with these newer things around AI.
Yeah, and you mentioned investment. I think that's certainly also key, right? Because ultimately, the business will have to invest in
Mhm,
skills and tools, more likely skills, and of course, that's what we happily provide. But
mhm,
skill building, right, is certainly a key aspect of the initial investments, then the tools, then the process changes, probably investment in automation. So I guess a lot of debates ensues generally in companies. What's going to be the payoff, right?
mhm.
So how would you go about measuring it? I mean, beyond the sort of immediate, I've saved X amount of time in this process, or I've been able to do this with Y% less labor, for example, beyond the sort of very focal operational cost savings, how do you measure the long-term ROI?
Well, how long's a piece of string, I suppose. But, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the measurement framework that you would use actually has to link the sort of let's call them the sort of the KPIs for AI, back to sort of the core business KPIs. So I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel when you're introducing new technologies into companies. They need to, we know from, years of research and observation of all kinds of digital transformations, and AI is sort of the latest and big one, but sort of the latest in a long stream of digital and tech transformations companies have been going through. That that they one of the factors that drives the success of those types of transformations is making them core to the business, and that includes in terms of how you measure performance, how you evaluate performance, work out the return on the investment and so on. Um, so I think that's, aligning it or just embedding it in your existing sort of key performance indicator frameworks is important. I think the other thing that, I always say to people is thinking about the time horizon over which you'd expect to see those returns. And there's no easy answer to that because it may well be if you I don't know, you use an AI system that ends up speeding up a process that allows you to reduce the lead time to market for something drastically, then and you implement that, then you may actually see that return really, really quickly. But there are some longer term investments that you might be making that you can't expect to see a 6 to 12 month return. It might be more sort of over a couple of years, particularly around sort of data investments. If you're sort of building if some companies are fortunate, they've got lots of data already and it's well organized and it's sort of say sort of a data rich organization. But other organizations on this journey, haven't been that way. And so they're having to make investments in laying the groundwork that they can then leverage once they've, got enough data to create custom GPTs, for instance. So, in that case, the ROI you wouldn't see, from those data and data infrastructure investments, for a while. So I think it's about having realistic expectations. But again, always linking it back to what's fundamentally the business trying to achieve strategically, so that you get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
Uh, so if you don't mind, Matthias, I'm going to turn the tables and ask you some questions now. I've had my turn of being in the hot seat, so now it's your turn. So let's kind of, maybe some of the thoughts that everybody watching have is thinking about, okay, this is all great, and I talked about sort of pilot to large scale deployment, or experimentation to large scale implementation. That sounds all very nice in theory, but what are some of the sort of practical issues here? So, what might be some of the biggest barriers that you feel organizations face when they're going from this sort of, let's call it phase one, small scale, to phase two and beyond, large scale implementation?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question, right? Because I think by now everyone is experimenting with AI in various forms, generally through teams of highly dedicated and motivated
Mhm.
data scientists that basically sort of say, look, we can do better here, and demonstrate that in principle AI has great potential for the business. But then, of course, comes the big challenge of how do you go from the pilots that demonstrates the capability enhancement that AI could provide to a full-scale implementation. There's two things that we see over and over again with the companies we interact with. First one is what you've already mentioned, and you said data investment. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, right? But people generally would assume that, well, you're running your business or have been running it for X number of years. You ought to have the right amount of data ready. And of course, that isn't the case. Generally, it falls down very quickly on data that isn't automatic, or the system isn't set up to automatically generate a stream of digital data. And let's start with that simplest case, actually. So let's assume you already have a lot of digital data, let's say from your operation. You then have at least a chance to dissect it. And very often, if you have, let's say, time series data, you have to worry about or decide very quickly what part of this data is actually meaningful, because very quickly you would be overwhelmed. So a key challenge we see is, if you have the data available, is to pick the right parts of the data that actually yield meaningful insights, because AI is only as good as it makes the decision that it informs better, right? That's where the payoff comes from. You use AI to extract patterns from data to inform a decision. That better decision enhances operational efficiency, right? That's the causal chain. So if you spend over too much amount of time and money on or working on the wrong data, of course, you will not lead to a great ROI in the end. Very often, though, the problem is the other way around, is that people would say, oh, well, this process would benefit from AI. Let's see what data they have. And then it falls down on very practical issues, such as the data is in the wrong format, so it can't be extracted. It has to, for example, be digitized to begin with. Then matching becomes an issue. Does this observation match up with this observation? In your world, it would be, okay, this product was produced then, it was sold here. How do I know which product actually ended up with a customer who's complaining or unhappy? And these are very mundane questions that will very quickly lead to issues. So we always say, look, 80% of your AI journey will be spent on preparing and collating the data. The third case actually would be that you have, in principle, an issue, and we saw this recently in predictive maintenance or quality control, I should say, actually. So in principle, AI is very able to help you with quality control. Let's say use cameras to make sure every chocolate bar that comes down the line looks exactly as it should. And that's fine if you have millions of chocolate bars being produced every week. But once you suddenly are in a situation where, let's say, you produce electric vehicle battery packs, or something smaller scale, or gas turbine engines for aircraft, and you look at the fan blades, and suddenly, well, you have only about 60 going into each engine, and suddenly this ability to learn from the image reduces. Why? Because out of those 60 that you produce, to produce those 2 air engines that you deliver every month, very few actually faulty. So meaning you don't ever collate enough failure images to really train the AI. So That's why, look at the data would be my first advice. Second barrier is skills, right? As I said,
Mhm.
the experimentation, and I guess we all see this, comes up comes up from teams that are highly motivated and trained. And they then have to persuade decision makers that probably aren't as familiar, or most likely aren't as familiar with AI. So the second barrier to look at is do those decision makers that then have to evaluate and basically sign off on AI, do they know enough to assess the risks and payoffs? And I don't think that's given. And very often, what I find in personal interactions with senior leaders is that they feel they cannot say that they don't know enough about AI, right? It's so prominent
Mhm.
in every writing, in every discourse that they are engaged in, be it with shareholders or their boards or their employees, that they often don't feel the ability to say, look, literally, I don't know anything about LLMs or agents. And I think that is something that's, from an HR perspective, needs to be handled. And I guess we are fortunate that we get companies that have felt that need and come to us for training. I really do feel for people that suddenly have to make decisions about AI without having the training to judge good from bad, right? And it's not about coding, it's not about knowing one algorithm over the other, but it's about knowing the principles, the risks and the benefits, and then being able to say, yes, in principle, this sounds like a great application. So, someone says, let's use an LLM to write out the safety manuals for our, baby care product line, then immediately all warning bells should be ringing. Or
Yeah.
if you start, capturing people's faces, for health and safety issues, that certainly is possible, but certainly brings you into regulatory territories where you should be aware that you are doing something that potentially has consequences on the regulatory side if you don't manage it well. And that's the level of knowledge I think you will need to adopt AI on a wider scale, right? As decision makers need to be able to say, yes, this works, or no, I don't think that's too risky for us. We'll not touch it.
So one of the think about those sort of more senior decision makers, senior leaders in organizations, one of the other sort of key types of decisions they need to make is about resourcing these AI initiatives, particularly, going from small scale piloting to large scale deployment. So, how do these sorts of decision makers in these companies ensure they would have the right resources
Yeah.
available to support scalable AI?
Yeah, no, good point. And I'll come back to what you said earlier, right? Ultimately, it comes down to the strategic direction of the company. What is your USP? How do you compete? And then the immediate first question is the AI you're going to develop helping you to compete better, right? Is it core competence or supporting your core competence, or is it not? So I think when you look at the resources, the first question is how core is it to your business? And if it is core, then the resources should be aimed at directed in-house development.
Mhm.
And I'll qualify this in a second. Not universally, but certainly in principle, that's what you should go for, right? It's having something that is custom built that you understand well because it supports your core operation. Turning that around, I think particularly smaller companies should absolutely look for off-the-shelf solutions for many AI applications, be it in financial analysis, be it in well, to take all the LLMs, right, in enhancing personal productivity, right? Because there is such a high threshold to developing these AI systems to a level where they really are so useful that most likely it's not your core competence. You're better off buying this in-house. So it's like any other technology, right? If it's core, it has to be in-house. If it's not, I think you should look to off-the-shelf products. The one qualification I'd like to make is the work many companies are doing in terms of customizing and working with foundation models.
Yeah.
And again, here, of course, fortunately, it's not a binary, buy or do it in-house, but there's a whole breadth of working with foundation models, such as custom GPTs being an obvious example, right? So here, I think the best way to look at choosing the right level of resources is to also work out what is the right level of customization of these models. How far do you need to go? Because the more customized you go, the higher the invest will be, right? And you can, and 80%, coming back to good old Pareto, I think in 80% of the cases, companies can get by with creating a custom GPT through prompt engineering and a combination of RAG, maybe even using OpenAI's plugin for custom GPTs or other tools, because that will give you all the customer service chatbots. I don't think there's any need to go into fine tuning, and it will give you all the basic, language-based interactions that you might need in terms of extract information, create a document, and the like. What it will not give you, and this is where we come to the specific applications, is if you make the AI your core product. Let's say in legal services, you heavily rely on the AI system to support your lawyers or your consultants in a management consulting setting. There, I think you should look at fine tuning, which of course is a much more labor intensive and a much greater invest. But again, it's much closer to the actual core competence that you're providing. And maybe lastly, just to finish off, I don't think there's any need for anyone to develop a foundation model unless your business is to sell foundation models, right? Because
Yeah.
I just don't see it's possible, right? I mean, you can even go to YouTube and have a couple of hours tutorial on how to build a transformer. But yeah, it's prohibitive, and the quality you're going to get is never going to be even near what commercial providers can do. Right? So see it as a spectrum, right? The right resource is a function of how close you are to the core competency that it supports. And therefore, I don't think it's not the case that everyone should build data science teams in-house that develop all AI systems within the firm. Yeah.
All right, so last question from me before we open it up to Q&A. So I'll just use this as a reminder. If anybody wants to pop any questions, use the Q&A feature. We've got a few in there already, but feel free to type in some questions and we'll get to them. Either in the Q&A box, there's a few there, or in the chat, there's a bunch there as well. But so the last question from me, Matthias, is more about governance. And so if we're thinking about responsible AI use in organizations, what sort of guiding principles and governance frameworks should companies be looking to adopt?
Yeah, very important point. It's not just that regulators are increasingly on the case, and of course we've got the AI Act, we've got AI law passed in Korea. Australia is on the case too, as you know, right? As is Canada with ADA. First and foremost, I think the most important statement about governance is that safe innovation yields long-term value, right? AI provides risks in terms of reputation. Well, getting AI wrong, right, provides reputational risks. It opens you up to liability risks. There are security risks. There are also regulatory risks. And in that sense, the AI governance is a mandatory step towards safe innovation, which will then enable long-term value. So which frameworks do I like? I like to start with consequence scanning. Personally, I think it's very important to begin with any AI project with understanding what will this AI adoption mean for the various stakeholders, and then think about the intended and unintended consequences, right? Because a lot of the issues, in fact, I would say, 80% of all AI failures we see in our database, and we've got over 700 now and numbers rising fast, are caused by avoidable issues. And they generally relate down to not having thought about adverse consequences or unintended consequences, particularly in relation to discrimination and bias. And secondly, using data that you shouldn't have used for this very purpose. So the regulators are rightfully saying, a system that poses a risk to fundamental rights has to be regulated. And so that's where pretty much all responsible AI practices are in fact an implementation of risk management, right? The idea being you work out what the risk level is, and that will determine how much efforts you need to do to ensure the safety. good news about this really is that for 80-90% of all AI systems that work in the background, look at the bottles going down the line to see if they're broken or not, or do our spam filters or open up our phone, right? Very little to nothing is needed from the regulatory side. But the minute you start dealing with personal data, where you start making decisions about people's lives, what loan they get, what the insurance premium should be, whether they're admitted to a university or invited for a job interview, the minute you do that, you need to demonstrate that they're safe, and I think that's absolutely right. Lastly, and you asked about the frameworks, the other one I really like is 3 lines of defense, right? Very often there's a temptation by the data science team to say, oh, this works, let's deploy it, right? We've tested it, we've validated it, let's go. Well, any AI system should have a second level of defense, past testing and validation, which would be the internal review board to say, okay, have you considered all adverse consequences, as I mentioned earlier, right, in terms of consequence scanning, and gives that another thought. And there should be a third line of defense at the senior level to say, yes, in principle, we support AI applications for this purpose within our organization. So consequence scanning, 3 lines of defense, and I saw a question here in the AI ethics regulation compliance program. Those are the ones we also teach for that reason, because I think they're very, very useful to know about, and certainly will help you, make sure that your AI adoption is responsible. Safe innovation to me is the one bit about long-term economic value generation. That's the key.
Great. So let's now go into some Q&A. So thanks everybody who's posted some questions so far. I'm just going to start cherry picking things, and Matthias and I can comment on them. The first one I'm going to go with is the question is organizations rush to automate with AI? Are we underestimating the long-term risks of poor data quality, outsourced data control, and the loss of human decision complexity in favor of efficiency? So what do you think, Matthias?
Well, I think we're all started by the recent benchmarks that show that the better the language models get, the more they hallucinate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it does make me think whether we've actually started to pollute our training data to such a degree that actually we are seeing this recursive feeding, right? So that ultimately could lead to model collapse. And it just makes me think that the assumption that we will have ever more data available for training, ever more good data available for training to improve our model performance, but that's not given. I think we are indeed, as some have said a while ago, actually, we're indeed slowly running out of good training data. So therefore, this assumption of ever bigger models trained on ever more data, I think is coming to an end, right? So we'll have to clearly sort of, I think there's a step change waiting to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to some of the things we were both saying earlier around sort of resources and even capabilities that you need to be thinking about, particularly not necessarily for deploying AI right away at scale, but sort of what do I need to be doing in my organization to get ready for bigger and better things, in the coming years. And obviously data quality is a big one, particularly if you're well, I think we both agree that building your own LLM is nonsensical. But if you're customizing something, building on top of those foundation models with your own data, that sort of data house, so to speak, needs to be in order from a quality standpoint before you do that, because you're then just going to be exponentiating errors, if you will.
Yeah.
Or bias in the data or whatever it might be that you should be concerned about. But equally, and this is maybe harking back. I mean, it seems like all we talk about is LLMs now, but let's not forget AI is more than just LLMs. And if we're thinking about sort of more machine learning type models for sort of predictive models, the data that you're putting in to make predictions about whatever it is relevant to that use case in the business. The quality there is really, really critical. So even at a small scale, before you even think about large scale, then the quality is even more of a concern if you're going to automate decisions off the back of those predictions. And and just sort of create an automated system. So getting that right and having people who scrutinize that, it certainly comes up. I mean, one quick example, sort of in my world, within the sort of the digital advertising world, um, when you bring generative AI into the sort of creative advertising workflows to, create content, basically,
Yep.
images of people, for instance, all sorts of biases that exist in, and this is also related to responsible AI, all sorts of biases that exist in training data sets for images around, ethnicity and gender and age and so on, will get perpetuated if you're not being serious about thinking about how you scrutinize the training data if you can control it, or if not, how you scrutinize the outputs and then teach the systems, and sort of reinforce the good and not the bad that come out of it. So it's a really good question because it is a very important kind of leadership responsibility to be thinking about data, given that is the core input here, one way or another. Um, let's maybe go to another question here, just skimming through the
To have
chat. Have you got one you want to go with, Matthias?
well, we also got questions beforehand. Zara's has forwarded those. So let me
Yeah.
read this out, and we can both answer it. In what ways can multimodal AI break down disciplinary silos to accelerate cross-domain scientific discovery? I can start on this because
Okay.
we've just written an open editorial for our key journal on generative AI use. Um, in principle, I think that multimodal AI, right? The idea being you use not just one mode, meaning text only or just images, but you combine this, right? So suddenly you can, because, well, the transformers tokenize everything anyway, right? So to a transformer, it doesn't matter whether it's an image or a piece of text, or a video or a sound sequence, right? So in that sense, the AI is agnostic to modes, at least when we talk about transformer architectures, which makes them inherently able to look for patterns across different data types, which, and this is where I agree, I'm not sure who posed the question, very much agree with the question, it offers a lot. Um, I'm a big fan of Gen AI, surprisingly here, but I do see a very specific danger in academic research, and that is not that we all now write our literature reviews with ChatGPT, or that ChatGPT can do it better than I could ever have done this in my 20 plus years. Um, I don't think the issue is cheating or even creating fake data, or the issue is not whether or not synthetic respondents to our research are viable, yes or no. I think the real danger is that if we increasingly really rely on transformer-based models in scientific discovery, that can produce new ideas by generating insights from existing patterns that we may or may not have seen before. If that becomes the mode, we will in the long run out of fresh ideas, right? Because all of these models are by default reassembling patterns that they have seen in existing data, meaning we'll run foul of creating truly new knowledge. I'm not saying there isn't any value in doing exactly this, but my big worry is not that we're using foundation models or multi-modal models to aid domain-specific scientific discoveries. My concern is that if that becomes the prevalent mode, we'll stop generating fundamentally new insights because we fall foul, we'll fall foul of the technological over-reliance issue that we always say you should be mindful of. And I think we are certainly also running the danger of that happening to us.
Yeah, I
I don't know what you think.
completely agree, and I'll sort of give a couple of additional thoughts and then use that to seg into there's a question in the chat that is sort of related to this in other kind of professions. But no, I completely agree that the sort of the novel thinking and the potential scientific breakthroughs are not going to come from just asking a large language model to give me the next research question. But somebody I was talking to recently actually used the phrase, they use ChatGPT as a critical sparring partner in their ideation process. which I think is a nice way of thinking about it. It's not going to do it for you. It's an augmented intelligence, not a replacement artificial intelligence. And I think that's a good way to think about it, which brings me to one of the questions in the chat, which is how can recent graduates, for example, in law, make sure they don't get replaced by AI as more and more entry roles are being automated? How can they practically develop the skills needed to stay relevant, and which are those skills? And it's interesting, actually. I was talking to a lawyer the other day, not a recent graduate, a partner in a law firm who was worried about this for themselves, not just their trainees and their graduates. Similarly, in accounting firms and sort of professional knowledge workers and advisory services, if you want to kind of categorize it that way. There is a lot that AI can do and automate, or from say a client perspective with law. I'm sure ChatGPT can give you a pretty good sense of what precedent case law might be on a certain matter if you give it enough information as sort of a client. um, but that's what I would say, and keen to hear your thoughts, Matthias. But my sort of quick reaction to that is to not see it as a replacement, but rather think about, well, what are the uniquely human and valuable human skills and capabilities you bring to the table that is not going to be offered by AI? So that's deeper advice, greater interpretation, judgment, those sorts of things, which I see. So if you're in one of those sorts of professions, I wouldn't be worried, but I think particularly if you're sort of a more entry level, as I think the person who asked the question is to think about how do you develop your own professional skills sort of alongside the AI and related technologies, because they're not going to go away. So you could put your head in the sand, it's probably a bad idea, or you can figure out how to embrace them and use them alongside what you do best, and only you as a sort of a human lawyer can
Yeah.
offer.
Well, I mean, I think absolutely agree. I mean, humans will not be replaced by AI, but they will be replaced by humans using AI, right? So this
Yeah.
augmentation argument that you made earlier is, I think, what we're seeing. I do not think you can take away the AI from let's say, the discovery process of modern law firms. So by default, you'll have to be able to engage fluently with these tools. You don't need to program them, but you need to be able to prompt them. And more importantly, you need to be able to understand the limitations, right? So what do you need to check? What can they not do? And then essentially use it as an augmentation of your process. But I mean, we've heard this before from law firms, right? It's a real problem because junior lawyers no longer grind their teeth on, sharpen their teeth on the early stages of these cases, right? So they don't really mature in this way. And I think that's a challenge more for the HR department within law firms, is how do you train up junior lawyers to the level where you need them to be independent, case representatives. And if you take away or automate or part automate that initial process. So in that sense, yeah, I think you need to become fluent in what these tools can and cannot do. And you need to stay relevant with latest developments. That applies to all of us. That in many ways hasn't changed at all, but it has been greatly accelerated, right, by the speed at which AI is moving. And yeah.
All right, so let's maybe, because we want to save a little bit of time at the end just to actually talk about the two particular programs that we both run and have developed, and to give you an opportunity to hear a little bit more about them. Not that it's a sales pitch, but I know many of you probably came because you're interested in learning a bit more about what you could do with us. But maybe we've got time for one or two more questions. And so, Mutis, I'm going to come to one which is here in the Q&A about scaling. Since we were talking about scaling quite a lot, I think it's good to come back to that. And they're asking, what does scaling look like? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Somewhere in between? Maybe something else?
Yeah, that's
Your
a good one.
thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think we've looked at AI governance models, and essentially you've got three choices, right? You've got the centralized one where you dictate policy and process from the top and everything feeds back for a sign off. And you've got the federal approach where essentially everyone is able to do it their way in the respective, let's say, business units or respective functions within your firm. neither of which are particularly effective in the long run. So what you really want is a hybrid approach, in my view, which sets out very clear principles and governance frameworks at the top within which you provide the freedom to act, right? So you provide a freedom, you provide almost like guardrails around what is possible, either for sandboxes or for full-scale implementation, and then you provide the freedom for the various sector, parts of your business to operate within those. Reason for that is because your functions within the organization will be different enough so that the AIs that they will be interested in are not sufficiently similar, right? So marketing to operations to finance to HR, they each have specific questions and specific interests, and algorithmic CV review and predictive maintenance just have nothing in common, right? And therefore you need that balance, that hybrid approach. And yeah, then I think it is to develop, cool pilots that provide street creds, those that solve real pain points that get people excited, and then you build up use cases based on that. So pick an easy target, a real issue that no one's been able to tackle before.
Yeah.
That's where you want to use your AI. That will get people excited in your function, and then you build it up from there. All within, in my view, in the setting of hybrid AI governance that provides sufficient freedom to experiment and solve real issues.
Yeah, it's a real kind of multi-stakeholder engagement type approach, particularly once you move into the scaling phase. So, one of the things that I like from what I've seen where, companies that we've been talking to a lot lately have been doing this well is they've had from the outset sort of involvement, more than just kind of, tacit buy-in, but actual involvement in making, different choices. Oh, do we go this direction or that direction, this use case, that use case,
Mm.
from, a whole kind of cast of characters, everyone from sort of, senior leadership, C-suite type folks who are ultimately, maybe commissioning these initiatives, but footing the bill. But the P&L owners in particular, let's say it's a brand in a country, the functional leaders, so whether that's sort of a COO or a CMO or a CFO or, wherever it's being
Mm.
deployed, this whole collection, but then also the actual sort of managers and employees kind of down at the operational level where these systems are being deployed.
Yeah.
Because their input and feedback along the way is really, really critical. So if you think about, the question around what does scaling look like, it's very much this sort of it's centralized and decentralized. The key is to have all the right people involved, to get feedback and sort of incorporate that feedback along the way. And I guess also realize scaling is not just sort of like, oh, okay, well, we've tested something out, we're going to scale it, and we sort of flick a switch, and all of a sudden we go from, one team in one office somewhere using this system to now every employee in the company has access to it. It's going to be a phased rollout, because that's how you gather the feedback and improve the systems as you're scaling them. So it's a bit of a misnomer perhaps to say sort of you go from pilot to scaling as if it's sort of a, flicking a switch. Obviously not, but it's important probably to underscore that. Um, all right, so I'm just conscious of the time, so we should probably. So thank you everybody for your questions. More questions than we obviously had time to answer, but we really appreciate you putting those questions in there, and others can see those questions, and hopefully that sparks some of your own thoughts as well. We just want to talk, a little bit about the programs. And I'll just bring up the slide. So this slide, those QR codes, if you're interested, they'll take you to the web pages for more information. But Matthias, maybe you want to speak about the first one, your AI ethics and regulation program.
Yeah. So actually, it was a question by Arnaud. Is there a test to select participants for the program? So let me start. We have a 6 weeks online program on AI, and that will teach you all the foundations of what you would need to know. So Arnaud, to your question, if you have that foundational knowledge, you know what AI is, then this course would be a great addition. If not, come to the first one. Because we will not talk about what AI is, but we'll go straight into why do we need ethics to judge, the quality or assess AI systems, right? Why is the ethical part so important to understand what fairness means? When do we discriminate? When is it okay to discriminate on what variable and the like? Then we'll go into the regulations, and we'll cover mostly the AI Act, but we also will go right across the globe and show you what is coming, because it's really important, in my view, to understand not just what the EU wants or what the NIST framework is in the US, but that you can see the patterns across all of them. Because as I said earlier, right, ultimately, auditing AI systems is a function of risk management. So understanding the risk level will determine what tests or what requirements are needed. And in the third module, we'll do an actual, we'll go through all the bits and pieces of, what does fairness mean? How do you measure it? What's robustness? What's accuracy and the like, to give you a sound understanding of how to assess AI systems, and then have you complete an actual conformity assessment under Article 43 for a high-risk use case. So it gives you a rounded understanding of what is AI ethics, what do we need it, why do we need it, what do the regulators want, and how do you do this in practice?
Great. And the other one, the AI Strategy and Leadership Program. So I am the academic director of this one. And it's a brand new program. It's an in-person program, a 5-day program in Oxford. The first cohort actually kicks off in just over a week. So we're really excited about that. And what we've seen is massive interest in this program. I think on the first cohort there's a bit over 40 people coming from, I think, 20 different countries, from all sorts of organizations in the public and private sectors. And it's really focused, this one is focused on more senior experienced leaders of organizations that really need to get their head around AI, but not in terms of just sort of basic understanding, but rather thinking about it in terms of strategy and then the leadership implications for them as business leaders when they're building out an AI strategy. So it's really it's an AI focused program, but really it's a strategy program. Very much the goal is to think about how to develop an AI strategy for your organization that aligns with your overall business or organizational strategy. Then how to implement that, thinking about operational considerations, resources, and so on. And then also the people side of it. So then how do you lead the change effort, manage stakeholders, and really make the strategic vision come to life and be not only successful, but long run successful, so sustainable advantage coming out of that. So that's a brand new program running multiple times a year, and we're really excited about that, where we're helping more senior leaders go from kind of a lot of what we've been talking about today, actually go from sort of test and learn, pilot experimentation, to really strategically embedding and aligning AI with everything else you're thinking about from a leadership perspective in your organization. So you've got the QR codes there. So please, if you're interested in more information, um,
Just
scan
note,
those and take a look.
sorry, Andrew. So there was a question. Could we provide
Yes.
the link? So Peter, who's actually head tutor on that program, hi Peter, put the link in. I've also added the link to all our AI programs, which includes the 2 ones we've just talked about, as well as the third, the foundational one, and the diploma in AI. So certainly have a large menu to choose from.
Yep.
Take a look. That link is also in the chat now.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. Yeah, I should have mentioned, there's more AI programs at Oxford Say than just these two. Matthias mentioned, sort of the more foundational online AI program that he's been running now for many years and is hugely successful and popular. But also if you wanted to take a degree or a part-time degree on AI, you've got the Oxford Executive Diploma on AI for Business, which I started back in 2021. With, I think we only had about 25 students in that first cohort. Now it's about 150. And I think if you ask our CFO, he'd love to have even more. But it's still delivered by human faculty. So there's a resource constraint there. But anyway, if you're interested, please check out the website, check out all the different programs, and and reach out for more information. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is quickly hand over to Alex. Alex is Senior Client Relationship Manager in our exec ed team. And he just wanted to say a few things about how to get some more information about these programs. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, and hello, everyone. So I'm part of the exec ed education program sales team here at Oxford, and I primarily support the online portfolio. So my colleague Darren, who's also on the screen there, he couldn't be here today, unfortunately. He looks after the on-campus or face-to-face portfolio that we run here. So please use his barcode for subsequent messages and questions. If you use the QR code under my name to book a one-to-one consultation, I can cover the AI and ethics program, but I can also cover the other foundational online program that we run for artificial intelligence. Just a quick summary of the program. We've touched on it a little bit, but it is a 4-week program. The first week is orientation. The next 3 weeks cover the modules. You're looking at about 7 to 10 hours per week of work required. So about 30 hours across the full 3 modules. The price is £1,500, and we ask that you pay that upfront and in full. It's worth noting on the price that we run a number of corporate discounts for group bookings. AI and ethics in particular is very popular at the moment, and we run a number of group bookings and corporate discounts that allow corporations to cascade that training through all levels of their organization across multiple cohorts. We've just started our April running of the AI and ethics program. The next one is on the 25th of June. The on-campus AI strategy and leadership program, the 5 days at Oxford, that's actually running on the 19th of May, as we've touched on. So it starts very soon. And if you have any questions on that, please do book a call with Darren using the barcode under his name. So that just really leads me to thank our panel for their time and sharing their expertise today. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you on these programs very soon. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.